the arrangement of the chronology is thematic rather than straightforward chronological. And the arguments then for the non-sequential, and of course if you can...
Was that number 3? Was that...
No, the first argument was figurative, and there were 1, 2, 3 arguments that show it was figurative. Now we're talking about non-sequential, all right? And the evidence that it is non-sequential, and by the way, all of these are, if you can show it's non-sequential, you are also showing it's figurative, because a figurative thing would be sequential. So here are actually more arguments that it's figurative, but these are distinctively showing that it is non-sequential. And the first argument here will be the very arrangement of the material, once again, suggests that, doesn't demand it, but once again, I would say it signalizes it, namely, the very strong, and this is the whole business of then of what the framework is. All right, so the framework and interpretation then says that we have the theme of the creation kingdoms, 1, 2, 3, and then the next 3 days, the theme of the creature kings, and then the 7th day, the theme of the creator king. But this strong thematic interest that informs the arrangement of the material suggests that, as it does elsewhere in the scripture, as for example in the whole book of Genesis, it suggests that the author is very much interested in arranging things according to themes, even though that defies the chronological order. That's what it means elsewhere, and so the suggestion is there that the strong thematic arrangement in Genesis 1 also is indicative of a non-sequential arrangement. But then secondly, and now this time not suggesting that, but demanding the non-sequential, and by the way, if you're talking about it, that's better to keep referring to it as non-sequential rather than non-chronological, because now it's not as though the framework interpretation doesn't believe that this is a chronological happening, that it's something that, yes, it's something that happened in space and time. It happened in a space-time continuum. It is chronological in that sense. But the arrangement of the material about this time event is itself non-sequential. So non-sequential is a better term to use describing what I'm trying to say than non-chronological. So the non-sequential view then is demanded by the relationship of the 1st and the 4th days, inasmuch as what is already attributed to day 1 then is attributed once again to day 4, and the very same things, and as a matter of fact, going back of the production of the events to the things that cause them. So and the days 1 and 4 demand, their relationship demands that the author has, having gone through days 1, 2, and 3, and brought us to the point where there were continents and trees and vegetation, all this stuff, that then in what is called day 4, he's gone back to that point where God was producing light and day and night on the earth. And that defies, that is chronological recapitulation. It is a non-sequential treatment. And then thirdly, the third argument we will develop is that light is thrown on the meaning of Genesis 1 as we look at Genesis 2. All through here, I keep emphasizing, our hermeneutical method is that of honoring the Scripture as the Word of God, and therefore using the principle of the analogy of Scripture to guide our interpretation of Genesis 1 by the light thrown elsewhere. Genesis 2, 5 and following does throw light on Genesis 1, and it happens to be light that you can't assimilate into a view that insists on the sequential arrangement. And so that will be the line of argument. Let's go back now then to point 1, major point. What is it then in the text that points toward, if not demands, the figurative interpretation? And as I said, the poetic form of it. Well, let's say a word about the poetic form of it. As you read through Genesis 1:1, it isn't just strung along like any prose paragraph might be somewhere in the Book of Kings or something like that. It is a neatly tailored from a literary point of view, is it not? It's divided into these 6, and using poetic language, we could say 6 stanzas. the 6 days of divine working constitute these 6 blocks, poetically, literarily, stanzas, and which have a uniform format. Each of them is structured in the same way in terms of fiat and fulfillment. Let there be, and there was. So each stanza then has that same form. Now, not just do they each have that same general form, but each one then is, or the whole thing is marked by a series of refrains, another feature of poetry, refrain lines that keep recurring. And just listen for a moment to several of these refrain lines, and you'll see that added up, they constitute pretty much almost the whole contents of what is said in about the 6 days. And God said, "Let there be," and it was so. And God separated this from that. And God made, and God named, and God blessed. God saw that it was good. And it was evening and it was morning. The refrain after refrain. This is characteristic of poetry. Strophic structure, recurring refrain lines. One other feature, very strong feature of Semitic Hebrew poetry, is the one we call different things, the parallelism of clauses, where you say something once, and then, in the case at least of synonymous parallelism structure, you say the same thing again in sometimes virtually the same words are in synonymous terms, and you're familiar with that all over the Bible, that kind of feature. Now, that feature of balance, thought, not necessarily meter, but thought balance, the parallelism of clauses, is a very distinct feature of Hebrew poetry. You needn't have it in order to have poetry. There could be other distinguishing features that justify calling something poetry. In, for example, the Song of Songs, it's beautiful poetry. Everyone recognizes that. And the estimates that have been made suggest that about half of the lines in the Song of Songs have this feature, but half of them don't. So you don't need it for poetry, but it is a conspicuous feature of much poetry. In Genesis 1, it is used sparingly, but it is present, and it's used effectively. It's used to highlight the 2 climax points in the account of creation. The first climax point is clearly the creation of man in the image of God. And the second and ultimate climax point is the divine completion of his work, the Sabbath. And interestingly then, it is just those 2 climax points that very effectively the author has introduced this poetic feature of parallelism, so that you would find it in Genesis 1:27, the first one. And as I said, it's not necessarily just synonymous terms. You can sometimes use virtually the same terms. In fact, that's what happens here. Then God said, "Let us make man," verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Synonymous parallelism. Then Genesis 2, verse 2. On the 7th day, God finished the work he had been doing. Yes, on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. All right, so here's an assortment then of poetic features that mark Genesis 1 and that justify the conclusion this is poetry. And as I said, doesn't prove then that necessarily that all the chronological data are figurative or dyschronologized or anything else. But it at least tells us, look, we're working with a kind of literature where figures of speech are prominent, and we shouldn't be shaken out of our boots if it turns out as even the second view, the Day-Age view, or framework interpretation holds. Now, right here, just speaking about this as poetic gets one into difficulty with some people, because they would equate poetry with non-historical. As I said, Dr. Young then, in response to my original article, wrote 3 articles, and one of his main problems was that I was using this language of poetic. And he was afraid that, if not, I don't know if he thought I was thinking it was non-historical or not. I find it hard to believe he would have thought that. But in general, else how he would think that way, because the liberal mind, to trying not to be too obvious in basing traditional thought to what they were doing, might then speak of their non-historical view and pass it. Use that language to dismiss what the Bible is saying off to the Siberia of non-historical. Now that's going on all over the place, and so Dr. Young was understandably concerned, unless that thing should be going on here. But certainly there is no necessary connection between the idea that you have a poetic, figurative description of something and saying that it's historical. Let me quick give a couple of my favorite illustrations of this, where everyone would be bound to agree and to recognize that figurative, strongly figurative language, though, is used, but the historical one is in the Song of Moses, Exodus 15. And in the 14th chapter of Exodus, you've had more of the straightforward prose account. And in straightforward prose, you don't get as much in the way of figures of speech. If the waters are dried up, it's attributed to, at least in part, to a strong east wind that was blowing and so on. So you get a much more natural, literal kind of account of the miraculous event of the crossing of the sea and the drying up of the waters. What happens when you come to poetry? Exodus 15, magnificent piece of poetry, the Song of Moses. And when it comes to this point, it doesn't talk about the east wind. It says, by the blast of his nostrils, the Lord dries up the waters. Anthropomorphism, a strong figure of speech. By the blast of his nostrils, he did it. All right? Is it non-historical because it has the figure of speech? So no, of course not. It's something that actually happened. Judges 5, another piece of poetry, another song, the Song of Deborah this time, also having to do with a great redemptive battle, victory type thing. And you get the prose account, and which speaks about the actual weather conditions that muddied up the whole thing and made it hard going for the chariots of the enemy and so on. And there was a perfectly natural explanation. And then in the poetic account, in the Song of Deborah, the stars were fighting in their courses against the enemies. Just to illustrate the fact that to say something is figurative is not the same as saying it is not historical. And certainly when I say that the Genesis chronology is figurative, I am not intending to say it's non-historical. It was historical. As I said a moment ago, this occupied space-time history. It was chronological in that sense, even if the narrative sequences is not sequential. All right, so that's the first point in connection with the thought that this was figurative. And then the second thing, which I see as more decisive, is the nature of the seventh day. And if I may turn again to the article of Space and Time and the Genesis Cosmogony and read from that for you. Okay. Under the heading of the seventh day, well, let's see what we have here. Might be reading more than I wanted, but it won't hurt us. God is present at the beginning of creation. He is the beginning. He's also the end, for he appears at the completion of creation as the Sabbath Lord. The seventh day has to do altogether with God, with the upper register, so on, the divine rest, which characterizes the seventh day as his reign, and so on. I think I can go down to the next paragraph. I'll come back to that one when I'm trying to make the central point that the chronology is describing heavenly events. Not only the identification of the Sabbath rest with God's royal session on high, but the unending nature of the seventh day of creation differentiates it from earthly solar days. The seventh day of that 7-day picture is an unending day, is my contention. And if the seventh day is an unending day, it's not a literal day. And if the seventh day, a thing called Yom, like all the other things called Yom, is an unending, non-literal day, that tells you what the other 6 are as well. That certainly the pattern is a consistent pattern. And consisting as it does, speaking now about that, God's seventh day. God's seventh day. Consisting as it does in God's status as the one who has occupied the cosmic temple, as the King of Glory, a status without the possibility of any interruption or limitation. He creates the world. He occupies his throne in the heavens as King over all. That's his status, the King of Glory, the King who consummated creation. And when did God lose that status? When was he dethroned from that? When did he cease to rest from his creation? To ask is to answer. He hasn't. This is eternal in the nature of the case, and this is God's seventh day. The seventh day is in the nature of the case unending. Now, that which you could gather just by analyzing what God's seventh day consists in is confirmed exegetically in Hebrews 4. Hebrews 4 deals with the subject of the Sabbath and speaks of this, and it quotes from Genesis 2, 2, and 3 there, so that we know it's talking about that seventh day of God. And what it does is to encourage us Christians in our pilgrim way that we are bound for heaven. Heaven understood as that seventh day, that place of God's enthronement with the angels, that upper register. And that's what Jesus has come for, and that's what he's redeemed us for, and that's what he will glorify us for, so that we can at last enter into that heavenly rest. And so Hebrews 4 is speaking about these things. So this is confirmed by the treatment of the theme of God's rest in Hebrews 4. That rest is identified in Hebrews verses 3 and 4 as God's seventh day of Genesis 2 verse 2, which is quoted there. Genesis 2 verse 2 is quoted there. The passage then expounds God's rest as an ongoing reality. It never ended. That rest is ongoing. Entrance into it being the final hope, the eschatological hope of all of us who are God's people, as it's expressed in Hebrews 4 verses 10 and 11. If the seventh day were not an unending Sabbath rest for God, but a literal day, then the question must be asked, would the next day be another work day for God? Introducing another week of work and rest for him to be followed by an indefinite repetition of this pattern, work and rest for forever? Are we to replace the Sabbath consummation doctrine of biblical eschatology with the mythological concept of time as cyclic? That's what mythology is. This is repeating. And that's where you end up with that mythological cyclical view of time if you understand God's creational seventh day as coming to an end, and then it would have to repeat the process. No, the biblical picture is that we don't keep on going in circles where we come to the consummation. God's already there. We at last will join him there because his rest was an ongoing one. In the Genesis prologue, the unending nature of God's Sabbath is signalized by the absence of the closure signature, the evening and morning formula. That signature is absent from the seventh day, showing that like as the seventh day is to the other days as being another Yom, it is one, unlike the others are pictured as being, the seventh day has no ending, it has no closure. So that's the point. It's not something profound or difficult, I don't think, to understand. Perfectly simple. What's the nature of the seventh day? It's unending, therefore it is not literal. And then the third point, as I said, has to do with the whole approach of the upper and lower registers that I'll develop later on. So let's move on right away to the next point, which is the evidence that chronological data in Genesis 1 are arranged non-sequentially. That is, that the narrative sequence is not intended to correspond to the actual historical chronological sequence. That's what we're arguing for. That the narrative sequence is not intended to correspond necessarily to the actual historical sequence. It may be, that some things are placed in a proper chronological position. The seventh day, the Sabbath is at the end, and logically it couldn't be anywhere else because the Sabbath marks the end of that process and so on. And you might get indicators that, not only is the account of the creation of man placed at the end of the 6 days, but that's where it would have happened because man's existence is dependent upon the presence of all of those things. So in certain instances, you might be able to see an appropriateness in the actual location, but there are many other places where the things are not at all appropriate and where problems are being created. So our first point now in this connection, then once again, is simply to call attention to this business. And as I said, to come to a proper appreciation of how strong is the thematic interest at work here. The creation kingdoms, light, darkness, day and night, creation of the visible heavens, the firmament, which produces then the sky, with the clouds, which are the waters above, and the waters below, which certainly are about to become the sea. And then on day 3, the other creation kingdom, which is the land and the vegetation. All right, creation kingdoms. Now, back we go, as a matter of fact, to the very time of day 1. That's not the case for day 2 and 5 necessarily, and 3 and 6, but here we are actually back to that time, but with this new theme that characterizes these 3 days, the theme of the creature kings, those creatures that God says to rule over corresponding kingdoms. And there is this coordination correspondence of days 4 and 1, 5 and 2, and 6 and 3. So that on day 4, we have the luminaries, whom God sets in the heavens to rule over the realm of day and night, light and darkness, to rule over them by setting the boundaries for them and so on. But it's a royal imagery, then that's what justifies the terminology I'm using of kings, creature kings. Day 5, you have the birds who rule over the sky, and the fish who rule over the sea, who rule over it in terms of the divine blessing mandate that here is your domain, go occupy it, fill it, enjoy it, exploit its resources to maintain your life and so on. And so here are these royal creatures, and here is their domain. And then, of course, climactically, here are the animals and man, and the land is their realm, and the vegetation is put at their use both for animals and men and so on. And then ultimately, of course, the man creature who is set over all the works of God's hands. And so the ultimate creature king, and finally the theme of the creator king of the seventh day. And we tried to describe the several views. We spoke a little more lengthy about that, but I think we all have to agree. A very instructive as well as impressive literary thing, but very strong thematic interests. And now this doesn't settle it. You could have something that was informed by thematic arrangement, and at the same time it could be with a proper sequence, with an actual historical sequence. It could be. And so the way I would speak about this is simply that this signalizes the fact that the thematic could have been overriding the literal, just as in the case of the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 that we studied. And we saw that there certain conventional numbers and patterns, 10 plus 3 names in each case, with the balance of Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, and the use of these conventional numbers. It didn't prove that these were incomplete genealogies, but it signalizes that the desire for these literary features and conventions did override the thought of literal completeness and so forth. It's that kind of argument which has its place. But then moving on from the kind of evidence that simply sets the stage for, suggests or signalizes, we move on now to the next point, which requires that we recognize that the arrangement is narrative arrangement is not intended to be, and then this has to do with the relationship now of days 1 and 4. And in one way or another, a couple times even today, we've already made the point that I want to make now. So you turn, again, it's nothing profound, it's perfectly obvious, it lies right on the surface of the text. You read what is attributed to day 1, you read what's attributed to day 4, same stuff, both instances. What was accomplished on day 1, the net result was that you start with darkness and you end up with the fact that darkness has been limited by the introduction of light into the situation. And by the way, the light is not some mysterious light source out in space or whatever, because presently God tells you what it is. He names it. He names it daylight. But that's the end of that discussion as to what is this light. It's that stuff that, any kid hearing the story would look out the tent flap and see daylight out there. That's what God's talking about, daylight, sure. And so day 1 then describes the introduction of daylight into the scene as something which bounded the darkness, and which, as a matter of fact, God sets up in terms of a cycle, an alternation of daylight with the darkness, which he calls then day and night. Now that's what was produced on already. That was functioning on day 1. What then is a day 4? Same thing, only now it tells us how God produced the daylight effect on Earth and the sequence of day and night. He produced it in the way he set up this solar system with Earth in relationship to the stars, and more particularly then in connection with the sun and the moon. So it was the light of the sun that brought daylight on the Earth, and it was the rotating of the Earth with respect to the sun and the role of the moon and so on that results in the cyclical alternating experience of light with darkness and day with night. And so it is exactly the same results that are produced on day 4. On day 1, why add day 4 at all then if it's the same thing? And to tell you about the kings whom God set to rule over that realm, and to tell you how it is that he produced those results. On day 1, you only have the account of the results. On day 4, you have the result of the cause. Fine, okay, but more specifically, it's not speaking in those abstract logical terms of cause and effect. It's speaking in terms of a kingdom and its kings. But expressed logically, that's the way it is. It's cause and effect, and cause and effect expressed temporally means that this, if anything, is before day 1. Okay? That's the argument, pure and simple. And it can't be resisted successfully, and you should just read all the attempts that have been made by the literalists trying to hang on to this literal view, which would be a sequential thing, how they can hang on to that in the face of this. And at this point, just notice how non-literal the literalist exegesis has to become in order to worm out of this unanswerable situation. Now, all kinds of attempts have been made to deal with them, and I have exhaustively tried to deal with those in this article on pages 14 to 18, and that is such a long section that I doubt that I want to read that whole thing to you. But the attempts to worm out of this problem take two forms. Some try to reinterpret what is said on day 4 about the creation and the positioning of the sun, moon, and stars, to reinterpret that so as to negate the idea of origination and to reduce work of day 4 to the mere appearance of things that allegedly were previously there. So the sun, moon, and stars were there previously, but they couldn't be seen. And so we hear this nonsense about some cloud cover, and all that happened on the 4th day was that the clouds parted a little and the stars began to play peekaboo down so that we could see them if we were standing down here. And that's supposed to be what happened on the... This is not literal exegesis of an honest exegesis of what the Bible is saying. It says that he made them, he put them there. All of the language of origination that is everywhere else in Genesis 1 used to describe origination. It's all used here to describe the creation here of the sun, moon, and stars. That's the picture that's being described literally here. And everything else is dishonest exegesis that tries to dilute it into anything else. Now, there are many then who recognize that's so. And that's only a contrived business to keep so light and day and night back here. And so here you get then the two essential ways of dealing with it. One is to suppose that we're dealing with some unusual heavenly light, some spectacular glory light of God. And that fails on all kinds of accounts. In biblical eschatology, the arrival in glory is at the end of history, not here at the beginning of history. And as a matter of fact, when at last we have God, the light of the world, which obviates the need any longer for the sun and so on, it also, when that glory light of God, that supernatural glory takes over, that puts an end to the sequence of day and night. That kind of phenomenon no longer exists when you have that kind of glory light. So that won't do. And the only other alternative then is to suppose that right from the beginning, God had so created the world that there was some natural system that would produce light on the world, set up the same sequence of day and night that we're familiar with, and yet was different than the one that we are familiar with and that therefore speaks about. And that defies the wisdom of God, that having set up a perfectly efficient system at the beginning, that he would jettison that thing, and what a cosmic catastrophe that would involve, and then set up another brand new one. That very much reduced is the gist of what I discussed with many other specific varieties of objection I tried to answer. So really, there is no answering this one. On the 4th day, plainly, this is where God created the luminaries, and that's the end of any literal sequence. The day age view very often argues in its behalf a harmony, at least between the sequence of Genesis 1 and the sequence that's uncovered by science. Ross and those like might argue along these lines. Day 4 is just one humongous exception to all of that, and no naturalistic understanding of the development of the cosmos is it the case then that we have the Earth with existing here by itself with daylight and all this kind of stuff existing by itself, and then later on sometime the rest of the universe is created. That the Earth existed as this little planetary speck in what otherwise is a void and hardly even could be called space anymore, and that only later on does God create the rest of the universe out there. That is supposed to be harmonious with modern science. That is a complete contradiction of it, and it compels you then to recognize then that the intention in Genesis 1, if you're going to be a believer in the inspiration and authority of Scripture, compels you to recognize that the intention in Genesis 1 is not to give you the actual sequence. Now, there are a few hands over there, and happily I'm going to be able to escape at the bell, but maybe you can catch me on the way out if you want to. We'll take it from there, Lord willing, tomorrow.